Many people have wondered why it is that the two-stroke outboard went away. But has it really died? I mean, there aren't any manufacturers anymore that make a two-stroke outboard that can be sold in most places around the world. But you might be surprised that Yamaha does still make the two-stroke Enduros, though you can only get them in specific locations where they are still sold. For everywhere else though, and the other major brands, it's pretty much a dead product. There are a few deciding factors that put the nail in the coffin for these engines though. Just like in your car, these are all four-stroke engines that have an oil pan that hold the oil that then you have to drain. You need an oil filter. So instead of changing the oil in our beloved two-strokes, we just burned it. So instead of having an oil pan, you had oil tanks that stored the oil unless you pre-mixed it with your fuel, which for some engines was the best thing for that engine, at least if you wanted it to last, that is. The burning of the oil is one of the reasons the two-stroke outboard industry was killed. Environmentally speaking, the engine is burning oil and then spitting out all the residue straight into the water, which will build up and obviously isn't good for the water. And since you were burning the oil, that means that you had to buy the oil. So now you've got an added expense on top of your gas that you've got to add oil to the engine or to your oil reservoirs every time that you wanted to go out on the boat. So when you filled up your fuel, you're adding another gallon, 2 gallons of oil to your bill, which at $20 to $30 a gallon, you're adding another 60 bucks or so to your bill just to go out on the water. Now then, once you've got that engine burning that oil, you've got to deal with all that smoke, and not to mention the smell. Even though for me, I still don't mind the smell of a two-stroke. And the smoke is considered more of a natural mosquito control system for most people. So our downside here is basically our environmental impact, the cost of the oil, as well as the issue of having to regularly change out the spark plugs. Burning the oil fouls out the spark plugs a lot sooner than when you aren't burning the oil. So pretty much every 50 to 100 hours you are changing out these plugs, especially if you are premixing and premixing a little heavier to add to the lifespan of the engine. Comparing this to getting 300 plus hours on a set of plugs in the four-stroke. Now a two-stroke in many cases, and depending on the model of the engine, is usually considerably dirtier under the cowling than a four-stroke. But that's probably a debatable statement, so we won't spend a ton of time on it. Just that most of us can relate to having to grab that primer bulb to prime up the engine and then having a filthy hand after having to touch the rigging going to the engine, compared to a four-stroke with fuel injection, where it's usually pretty rare to have to use the primer bulb, because most of the time the engine stays primed up and there's just no need of having to prime the fuel system, which is just a convenience feature, I guess you could say. But when you move on from that, we could pretty much stay on this fuel topic, which might just be the biggest reason that pulled most people away from the two-stroke, being our fuel economy. A four-stroke pretty much just doubles the fuel economy of a two-stroke. I can remember my 225 Ocean Pro, and that thing was lucky to get a mile to the gallon. And then on my 250 OX66, now that thing really did get about a mile to the gallon in fuel economy. Whereas most of these four-strokes are getting well above double that. Depending on your boat and the engine at cruising speed, sometimes you're seeing 2, 3, or even a little higher than that miles to the gallon, which is insane. And just like in some of your cars, how they are increasing the fuel mileage is by adding a lean burn type of feature to the engines, where they set a parameter to notice when you are cruising. And basically what will happen is the engine will advance the timing, then it will lessen the amount of fuel that it gives to the engine. This is what's going to change the air to fuel ratio, which basically leans it out. But what this means to you is that they will set the parameters up to do this when you are cruising without losing any speed or power, just consuming a lot less fuel, which in turn increases your fuel economy. And with the prices of gas, every ounce of fuel matters. And for commercial boaters and recreational boaters, having to go to the pump a lot less and spend twice the amount of time on the water, this is a massive advantage for the four-stroke. Something that really held on to the two-stroke though is the weight aspect of the four-stroke. They have more moving parts to them, which makes them a lot heavier than the two-bangers. And when we were talking about repowering a boat, taking off the light two-stroke and adding a couple 100 pounds extra for the same amount of horsepower on the back of the boat, that's a huge disadvantage to the four-stroke. because this can completely change the ride of the boat. We have videos covering the repower process as well as what happens to the ride of the boat when you start adding weight to the back, like brackets and 4-strokes, so you can check those out for that information. Now with time, the 4-strokes have gotten a lot lighter and certain models have very similar weights when comparing horsepower to weight ratios with the 2-strokes, which makes the weight issue not so much a consideration and has been a leading factor to many boaters letting go of the 2-strokes for the 4-stroke. Especially when talking about, say, bass boats, where the power factor is huge. Losing even 2 miles an hour in the bass boat world is a disaster, and because the 2-stroke takes less strokes, they do pack a heavier hit and have that instantaneous power advantage, and that's just another reason why many are sad that these days have come upon us. Now outside of all these factors, there is also the noise aspect. That, depending on how you use your boat, is a consideration. If canal cruising and sunset entertaining is your thing, then the vibration and loudness of a 2-stroke is something that many people think about. And when you get on a boat that has a 4-stroke, you can barely even tell that they are running. The smoothness and quietness of these engines has pushed many people over the fence to where they are never looking back. As for me, I like the water and the boats, so I'll still run a 2-stroke if the opportunity presents itself. Until I can't afford the gas anymore, that is.